p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 6 Eastern Time. We have Days Like This, our current moment panel with Jody Dean, Doug Henwood, Aziz Rana, Charles Mudede, and Colleen Lai. But the event at the moment is global housing struggles. It's curious that housing is in the news here in Seattle today. The headline in the Seattle Times reads, Seattle Social Housing Initiative faces early opposition from established housing providers. An initiative that is going to create a public developer insulated from the market to create affordable housing is being opposed not just by the real estate state and developers, but also by the traditional nonprofits who try to but don't succeed in providing enough housing for the unhoused here in Seattle. But we'll get into that more in the panel. I want to introduce to you now our moderator today. Samuel Stein was here in Seattle the last time we did Red May Live, which was 3 years ago. It's unbelievable that we're still on this. He's the author of Gentrification in the Real Estate State from Verso, Capital City, Gentrification in the Real Estate State. Sam writes about the politics of housing, real estate, urban planning in New York. He's been published in The Guardian, The Village Voice, the Verso book I mentioned, and he's a member of the steering committee for the Planning Network, the Organization of Progressive Planning. Sam, welcome back to Virtual Seattle. Welcome to Virtual Seattle after coming to live Seattle.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. Sorry not to be live again this year, but thank you for pulling this together. Thanks to the whole team of volunteers who make Red May possible. To start with a brief announcement, unfortunately, Ananya Roy is out sick today and can't join us, so we'll miss her presence and wisdom on this panel. But we have a great group assembled under the banner of global housing struggles. And there's something of a contradiction in that title. And in some ways, there's nothing more local than your home. Housing issues are often defined at the urban levels, sometimes the state. The biggest scale that mainstream accounts usually grapple with is the national. And yet housing struggles, even ostensibly local ones, really always are international in truth. It's the capital that goes into investing, developing, buying, and managing housing. It's certainly not local, and it's often international, with international conglomerates increasingly concentrating ownership of housing. Blackstone is the most famous example of that, of course, but it's far from the only one. But also the policy regimes and political currents that govern our housing system aren't geographically stable or local either. They migrate and travel from place to place, fueled by both the imperialist imperative of the US and other dominant countries, but also by the internationalist imperatives of our movements, which send emissaries and share documents across borders. The materials that go into building housing are, of course, internationally sourced. The human labor that goes into building and maintaining quote unquote local housing is often transnational. And the people who make up housing movements around the world are often, though of course not always, they have experienced international migration themselves. So even local housing struggles are themselves global housing struggles. The struggle over the right to housing and the ability to be in a place and secure one's future there is just as intensely local as it is intensely global. The group of scholars, activists, and scholar activists that we've gathered here today to share their insights into global housing struggles through their experiences and understanding of local housing struggles. Through their presentations and the conversations that follow, I hope we can pull out some threads of continuity, but also contradiction between them, and think together about housing movements, about real estate capital, and about the role of the state as both a housing guarantor and as the denier of housing at a mass scale. We're going to start in South Africa, the setting of Zachary's new book, Delivery as Dispossession, which was the impetus for this talk. I wouldn't be surprised if we return to South Africa at various points afterward. I'm now going to read the biographies of our speakers, and then they'll speak in the order that I introduce them. Then we'll hear from Philip about what else is going on with Red May. Then I'll ask some questions to draw out themes between the presentations, and we'll get questions from the audience. The whole thing will be about 90 minutes. So we'll start with Zach. Zachery Levenson is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg. He's the author of Delivery as Dispossession, Land, Occupation, and Eviction in the Post-Apartheid City, released in April of this year. He's also an editor of Spectre. Tara Raguvheer is the director of KC Tenants. She is also the director of the Campaign for a National Homes Guarantee based at People's Action, a national network of grassroots organizations committed to economic and racial justice. KC Tenants, founded in February 2019, has built a base of more than 250 tenants who have held landlords accountable, made housing a central issue in municipal politics, and written and passed a municipal tenants' Bill of Rights. For 7 years, Tara has spearheaded eviction research in Kansas City through the Kansas City Eviction Project, a collaborative of data scientists, community leaders, academics, and lawyers. Tara cut her teeth organizing in the immigrant rights movement. Her research on eviction and poverty in Kansas City is cited in the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Evicted. She is an Australian-born Indian-American immigrant who came to the U.S. with her family in 1995 and grew up in Kansas City. Next, Rob Robinson is a formerly homeless community organizer and activist based in New York City. His work focuses on changing people's fundamental relationship to land and housing. He works with social movements around the world, including the movement of people affected by dams in Brazil, the landless workers movement in Brazil, the shack dwellers movement in South Africa, and the platform of people affected by mortgages in Spain. Rob is the USA-Canada coordinator of International Alliance of Inhabitants, an alliance of 12,000 members worldwide, which supports a zero evictions platform. In the US, he works with communities on several social issues, including poverty and debt, police violence against the poor, gentrification, and access to broadband. Rob is currently an adjunct professor of urbanism in the Design and Urban Ecology program at Parsons New School University. So I am excited for this panel, and I will pass it on to Zach.
Great. Well, thanks to the Red May Squad for having me, and to Sam for that generous introduction. And I'm interested to see, especially as I talk a little bit about sort of why the state tends to evict mass land occupations in South Africa, to what extent this is in tension with this idea of the real estate state, and to what extent it actually sort of works with it in a slightly different way. So about a week ago, as Sam mentioned, I came out with this book on land occupation and eviction in post-apartheid South Africa. And it's based on research I've been carrying out in land occupations and informal settlements in Cape Town since 2011. And so today, in the time I have, I wanted to lay out some of the book's main arguments. So I'm going to talk about the struggle against eviction in the context of these mass land occupations, and then say a bit about how these struggles tend to play out in contemporary South Africa. But first, I wanted to introduce the project by way of the book's title and explain what it refers to. In other words, why the thing is called Delivery as Dispossession, Land Occupation and Eviction in the Post-Apartheid City. So you're probably mostly familiar with the idea of dispossession, which I'm effectively using here as a synonym for eviction. But let me say a thing or two about delivery. So again, the book is called Delivery as Dispossession. And so if dispossession is eviction, I wanted to say a couple things about what delivery means, or how I intended at the very least. So under apartheid, which ended in 1994, roughly 3.5 million Black South Africans were forcibly evicted from their homes. Many of them were pushed out of city centers, relegated to the peri-urban fringe, where they're left to provide for themselves. Others were removed from urban areas altogether, dumped in underdeveloped areas, notoriously called Bantustans. But in general, we can say there was quite a bit of state-ordered dispossession that proceeded under apartheid. But after apartheid, the rhetoric changed drastically, as we might expect. So Nelson Mandela's first Minister of Housing, Joe Slovo, made it clear right off the bat that Mandela's election itself, quote, did not deliver liberation, It has only provided us with a launching pad to build a liberated South Africa. So how to bring that about? Slovo continued, quote, "Housing is not a privilege. It is a fundamental human right. To live in an environment of degradation," he argued, "is to produce a degraded people. We have striven endlessly for freedom and liberation. Now is the time to deliver." And deliver the government did. So to date, the African National Congress, or ANC-led government, has delivered more than 4 million formal homes, all in the name of remedying apartheid-era dispossession. And so we wind up with a rather neat periodization. Apartheid as dispossession, post-apartheid as delivery, as in housing delivery. But there's a problem, I think, with this sort of tidy opposition. Dispossession and delivery are not necessarily antithetical concepts. The post-apartheid housing delivery program, for example, actually began under apartheid. And you're probably thinking, why in the world would the apartheid state deliver housing? Well, in uprooting people from city centers, the government sometimes built new neighborhoods far from downtowns, and sometimes not in cities at all. In other words, they delivered homes in the name of facilitating dispossession. But after apartheid, the relationship between these two terms is reversed. The government no longer delivers in order to dispossess. Now it dispossesses in order to deliver, or so it claims. So what do I mean by this? That the government dispossesses in order to deliver. So the government may be delivering millions of homes, but the scale of racialized dispossession in a settler colonial context is such that delivery isn't some kind of immediate solution. Given the limited funds budgeted for housing delivery, distribution has proceeded so slowly that in most cities, the backlog of those in need of housing has actually increased, or at least remained constant, since the end of apartheid. The fact that delivery isn't immediate means that residents need to wait for housing. But according to one of the country's most prominent housing rights lawyers, the average wait time in Cape Town is now 60 years, 60. So just 4 years below the country's average life expectancy. So what are residents supposed to do in the meantime? In other words, as they wait? Without any other options, they typically occupy land. Sometimes they secure intermediate solutions, like renting a shack in someone's backyard. But for those without any disposable income, occupation, or what government officials continue to call land invasion, is unavoidable. When people occupy land, it's rarely a small-scale affair. So, to give an example, 2 occupations I began studying a decade ago were both fairly large, though they began in different ways. So in one case, a political party front group, actually a front group for the ANC, organized the occupation, holding meetings regularly before it commenced. And on the first day of the occupation, really early that morning, thousands of people moved onto a plot of land owned by the municipal government. In other words, it was public land. By the next morning, cops were attempting to dismantle shacks, and armored vehicles from the government's so-called anti-land invasion unit, which is actually part of Cape Town's Department of Human Settlements, essentially their housing department. They have this unit called the anti-land invasion unit. And so working with the police, they were on the scene right away. And they would fire rubber bullets, a high-powered water cannon. The second occupation I studied moved a little more slowly. So it began with a half-dozen occupiers remaining out of sight. And when they weren't disturbed, others joined them. Within 6 months, there were 2,000 shacks on the field, despite the fact that it was private property. It's actually owned by an absentee landlord, a company that ran a sand mine and was sort of governing that land from a distance. Within 6 months, there were 2,000 shacks on the field, but the owners of the land did not bring a case until the government begged them to do so. So we might imagine a situation in which the landlords are begging the government to intervene. But here's a situation in which the government is begging these absentee landlords to bring a case. But they waited for months. And so by the time they filed for an eviction order, it was effectively too late. There are some 6,500 people living in the occupation. Regardless, in both cases, Cape Town housing officials sought to have occupiers evicted. Why? When I began this project over a decade ago, I assumed this was a kind of standard gentrification narrative or something closer to, we might say, land grabs. But in either case, I assume the primary reason that housing officials want occupiers off the land is to protect the sanctity of private property and maintain real estate value. I was wrong in this particular context, and for a couple reasons. So first, many of the occupations I observed that took place on private property were actually tolerated, whereas many of those that I observed on publicly owned land faced eviction. Second, when I interviewed countless housing officials, I noticed a recurrent trope that tended to moralize occupiers, consistently dismissing them as so-called queue jumpers, a term I want to say a little bit about. And I should mention this was not limited to Cape Town. So when I interviewed housing officials in Durban and Johannesburg, same kind of language, dismissing these occupiers in really moralistic language as queue jumpers. So housing officials tend to divide those who are on the housing waiting list, right? You register on this waiting list and then wait patiently, in theory, for government housing. And so housing officials tend to divide those on the waiting list into two categories: those who wait patiently and those who do not. Occupiers in the latter category, those who don't wait patiently, are attacked as queue jumpers. The claim is that they occupy land in order to jump to the top of the waiting list and get formal housing right away. But there's an obvious problem with this formulation. Queue jumping isn't produced by residents at all. I've yet to encounter a single resident who occupied land in order to obtain a government house. They occupied land because they had no other option in the meantime. In other words, to secure access to housing immediately, but auto-constructed housing. Once they do build shacks, housing officials see this as a visible sign of the government's failure. They publicly blame so-called queue jumpers for the slow pace of delivery. In other words, they insist that occupations are the cause of the housing crisis rather than the consequence of the housing crisis. And so when housing officials target occupations for eviction, this is the ultimate rationale, that they're queue jumpers, this kind of moralism. Paradoxically, they dispossess occupiers in the name of delivery. Hence the title of the book, Delivery as Dispossession. But in reality, it's not occupiers who are obstructing delivery. Housing officials choose to bump them to the top of the waiting list in order to cover their own asses. And of course, clearing these occupations does nothing to resolve the crisis. If anything, it reproduces the problem anew, as dispossessed residents are forced to occupy yet another plot of land. So the bulk of the book is an account of two such occupations that occurred roughly simultaneously in the same township of Cape Town. One was evicted, the other was tolerated. And while I don't have time to go into much detail here, I just want to close with a few points I draw out ethnographically in the book. Land occupations are a very particular kind of struggle. Occupiers typically are not trying to struggle against the state. They're usually trying to avoid being detected by the state altogether. But as I show in the book, in nearly every case, they wind up struggling against the state anyway. Why? So just a word on the legal situation in South Africa, which is quite particular. So South Africa's post-apartheid constitution guarantees the right to housing and freedom from eviction, something rightly celebrated by observers. But there's also an unexpected consequence of these constitutional rights. Occupiers begin on their own terrain, so to speak. They don't ask for land, they take it. But once detected by government officials, the case winds up in the courts. All occupiers therefore inevitably find themselves squabbling over this or that policy through legal intermediaries rather than straightforwardly appropriating land and defending it directly. Constitutional rights, then, are a double-edged sword in this context. Surely the right to housing is progressive, but it absolutely shifts all substantive debates onto a terrain shaped and controlled by government actors. And this terrain is ultimately about language. So in order to be heard, occupiers have to adopt the forms and languages of the state. But as soon as they translate their demands into this obligatory idiom, they find themselves no longer in protest or resistance, but in dialogue. Now, I don't want to sound too pessimistic here, but I do think that we need a sober assessment of institutional conditions in which land occupations occur. If we want to demonstrate solidarity with them, as I unconditionally do, I think it's essential to think through the strategic limits of romanticizing a particular organizational form. To be clear, land occupation is a really useful strategy for obtaining immediate access to land and housing. But the promise of obtaining toleration through the courts tends to tie up occupiers in these protracted legal battles that frequently end in eviction. And where straightforward eviction isn't the outcome, occupiers often remain in a state of legal indeterminacy, which can drag on for many years. So a key question then becomes how to occupy land while avoiding ceding the train of struggle to the state. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing the other talks.
Thanks so much, Zach. Gave us a lot to think about. We're going to move next to Tara.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Tara Raguvheer, and I am an organizer with KC Tenants here in Kansas City, Missouri. I also work with a righteous group of tenants across the country who are fighting for a national homes guarantee. So I'll actually start by telling you a little bit about the campaign for a national homes guarantee and then zero in on our work with KC Tenants. Super inspired to be on this panel with some amazing freedom fighters from around the world and have learned a lot from listening to just that last talk. So to begin, the campaign for a national homes guarantee, I think, is rooted in an analysis that it sounds like many of my other speakers on this panel share, which is that in the richest country in the history of the world, we can and we must guarantee that everyone has a home. And the theory of the homes guarantee is about transitioning from a world that treats our homes as commodities and treats human beings as line items in other human and institutional budgets to a world where housing is actually guaranteed as a public good. And within this platform for a homes guarantee, one of the main demands is for millions of units of social housing, which is to say housing that would be off of the private market, not available for speculation or investment, not a terrain for eviction or dispossession, and actually a terrain for collective ownership and democratic control. And so we've been sort of proliferating this idea around social housing at the federal level for many years and are really encouraged to see groups across the country take this up as part of their local struggle as well. So that's a little bit about the homes guarantee. I can speak more about that if folks are curious, but I actually want to zero in on KC Tenants because I think that's kind of that's the locus of my personal struggle and also the place where I learned the most from the leaders with our citywide union. So KC Tenants is the citywide union, a citywide tenant union in Kansas City. We were founded in 2019 by Tiana Caldwell, Brandy Granados, and Diane Charity, all of whom are women who have experience with the violence of our housing system today. We had our first meeting on February 17th, 2019, and about 12 people attended. The next week, we had about 35 people. The week after that, about 55. And 2 days later, we launched KC Tenants on the steps of City Hall with over 120 people with demands for the city to take up on behalf of tenants. And the rest is history. And in the last 3 years, we've built a ton of power. We've won, we've lost, we've studied both our wins and losses, and I think applied what we've learned from that study to sharpen our strategy and build more and more power over time. In 2019, we successfully made housing kind of the key issue in our municipal elections. The theory around that was not actually that we felt that intervening in the election itself was the most strategic thing we could do, but rather that the election provided a platform for us to politicize the city around our struggle and to really humanize the founders of our organization, the leaders of our organization, as people for whom politics in the city needed to work for really the first time ever. The other kind of motivator was that our leaders were telling me and telling us that if we did not intervene and make housing the key issue in that election, they really couldn't see themselves in Kansas City anymore by the time the next election would come around. So for them, there was a sense of urgency that meant that we needed to make this a kind of key piece of political dialogue in 2019. We did that. We elected the mayor and some pro-tenant members of council, but we were sort of working with the world as it is in terms of politicians who already had thrown their hat in the ring. So of course, we knew that our struggle was far from over. And many of those people who positioned themselves as our friends back then, of course, ended up not being as friendly as they positioned themselves to be. Later that year, we went on to write a Tenants' Bill of Rights, enshrining tenants' right to organize and multiple kind of anti-discrimination clauses in our municipal law and code that were not there before. This was really important for us as one of our first terrains of struggle, because landlord-tenant law in Missouri is so brutal and violent towards tenants. So we wrote this Tenants' Bill of Rights. We won it in December 2019 and faced a lot of loss along the way. A lot of core demands that were in our original Tenants' Bill of Rights were cut out and left on the cutting room floor. So we, again, knew that we were not done. And then moving into 2020, COVID hit, of course, and many of our leaders were sent home from work. They lost employment and struggled to pay the bills. And other leaders in our base were still working, or forced to work on the front lines, but subject to unsafe conditions and still really untenable financial conditions as their kids were sent home from school, as family members got sick. And our base started articulating a demand that was then widely and deeply felt across the country, which is that they felt they shouldn't have to pay the rent. So we started organizing around rent and mortgage cancellation. We also won a short-term eviction moratorium that spring, but it expired by May 2020. So basically from May 2020 on, we had to organize to take matters into our own hands and stop evictions, which, as I think most people here know, evictions are tantamount to a death sentence in a lot of different circumstances, even outside of the context of a pandemic, but especially in the context of a pandemic, especially pre-vaccine. Housing was the vaccine. We were told to stay home in order to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe. And without that ability, the state forcing people to the streets was the state basically disposing of people who they deemed unworthy of that kind of protection. So we, played it nice for a while. We wrote letters, we held vigils, we, lobbied all the right people. And the courts remained open. And in fact, in Missouri, evictions started occurring over conference call in an especially brutal way. So starting in about July 2020, we decided that we had to channel the energy of the chant. If we don't get it, shut it down, and actually just start shutting down evictions at scale. And so we did. We experimented with tactics for months and months, and we ended up disrupting evictions in person. We chained our bodies to the doors of the courthouse. We blockaded individual evictions. We disrupted the conference call evictions that were taking place. And all of this activity culminated in a month of escalated direct action in January 2021 that we called Zero Eviction January. And we actually shut down the entirety of the eviction machine that month, disrupting over 911 evictions and keeping thousands of families in their home. And on the other side of that, we decided that we did not want to continue in a reactionary mode forever. We wanted to recommit to proactive power building strategies and really invest in building a citywide union that could stop the state from this kind of violence in the future. So we have done just that. And actually tomorrow we're officially launching our citywide tenant union with a goal of organizing 10,000 members into our union by the end of the year. In the meanwhile, we've organized buildings and neighborhoods across the city. We've taken on gentrifiers, we've taken on slumlords. Again, some wins, some losses, always a bunch of lessons about how we can sharpen our practice. So I'll leave it there, and I'm really excited to engage in conversation with the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tara. That was really exciting. We're going to move now from Kansas City to New York and beyond with Rob Robinson.
So thank you, Sam, and thank you to everybody at Red May. It's an honor to be in the space with warriors. And Tara, I'll let you know, I've been following your work for years. We invited you to Power at the Margins, of which I'm one of the steering committee members. It didn't happen because of COVID, but it will happen in the future. So we'll look to bring you back. I just want to share that with you. And Zach, here in your presentation, I have some strong ties to South Africa. I don't know how much folks have shared with you. And I'm just going to ask everybody to take a moment because I have family there. Abashali Base Monjondolo is family to me, the Shack Dwellers movement. And we lost a woman leader who was shot in the back last night. I got an email at 3 o'clock this morning telling me that Nkuthala Mabaso, somebody I know well, was shot in front of her children, took 4 bullets to the back and a bullet in front of her kids while she was lying down. So that struggle continues there. The human right to housing is embedded in the Constitution, as you say, but realizing it is something different. But I appreciate that movement. I learned about that movement when I was doing the work of Take Back the Land. They were inspired by the work that we were doing and reached out to us directly. Take Back the Land was a response, if folks don't know, to the foreclosure crisis of 2008 and 2009, where people were being forced out of their homes. And the Obama administration sent a message to us in general that it's okay for you to fail, but the big banks can't fail. And he took our tax money and supported the banks while those banks foreclosed and evicted us in record numbers. So our response was to take those houses back by finding houses that were foreclosed by a bank or government agency, breaking in them and moving the families back in there and defending their rights to be in there using international human rights mechanisms and law. So it's the foundation of my work revolves around human rights. I'll just share with you folks, you heard Sam read my bio. I'm formerly homeless, and that's what brought me into this work. That I spent 2.5 years on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City homeless shelter, and that transformed the way I look at the world. And so what do I mean by that? You're taught certain things as a young person, and then you go out into the world and you experience the world. Well, that time on the streets in Miami and what was happening around me helped me to form a theory in my head. And that theory went something like this: that gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. It seemed that there was a predetermined path for some people to go down, mostly people that look like me, Black, brown, immigrant people, poor communities. And I saw this parallel to going back from the time that this country was created. And, the dispossession in your title, Zachary, brought back a lot of memories as I started to think about. I've always targeted the Constitution in this country written in 400-year-old good old boys language versus that Constitution of South Africa written in 1996 with some guarantees in it. You may not realize the guarantees, but it's in writing. So you have a foundation for your struggle, right? The Brazilian Constitution, where I do a lot of work, also says that land has to serve a social function or a social purpose. But property rights are put before people in this country, and that's always been problematic to me. Or let me say, in the transformation part of my life, because prior to that, I wanted to be a landlord. I saw great value in owning property and renting it out until I went through what I went through and the transformation happened. So that has led me to connect with international social movements and Tara, I heard you mention that there's zero eviction days in January. International Alliance of Inhabitants every year has World Zero Eviction Days in October, the month of October, because the UN says there's a zero eviction day, October 1st. Now, we said, no, it's a month. And we carry out a series of actions around the world and would love to connect with you guys. And I'll reach out to you afterwards about that process. I think as we collaborate around the world, I think that makes our movement stronger, because what we're challenging, as you clearly laid out, are global forces. We may work locally, Tara, but these forces are global. You heard Sam in the introduction mention Blackstone. Well, it's been a target of us here in New York. It's been a target of people across the country. But I really honed in on the struggle of Blackstone working with the PA out of Spain, the platform of people affected by mortgages, a group that formed itself after going through some of the similar struggles that we're going through here, or that we went through with the foreclosure crisis. So a bank called Catalunya Bank sold their mortgage portfolio to Blackstone, and some of the same effects, foreclosures and evictions ramping up in record numbers. The PA is a very vocal group and very well known, and they were just here in New York about a month ago. And, you know, I always have the pleasure of working with them and going to Blackstone, and, you know, they see actions. They do actions a little bit different than we do them here, Tara. They're not afraid to climb up on buildings. They're not afraid to use some harsh language, and it forces some of the executives of those companies to come outside. And, you know, I think also along that line, they support struggles here. So much like Kansas City, Tara, we went through COVID, and we first got our first eviction moratorium in March. I believe it was March 13th of 2020. That came down from our court as we started flooding the chief court officer, or the person in charge of Office of Court Administration in New York. I'm just blank with her name right now, but we flooded her with emails starting on a Thursday, and by Sunday night, we had in our hands our first eviction moratorium. They kept repeating. We put a lot of pressure on our government. We kept getting short-term moratoriums, and we carried it out until they finally expired this past January 15th. But about midway through, we stopped calling them moratoriums, Tara, because as soon as you get down to the final days, all of our membership and all of our base is wondering what's going to happen. We started to call them temporary protections, and that sort of pissed off the people in power to start to do something different, right? We challenged them. Okay, you gave us a temporary protection for 3 months, but it's over. What's going to happen now? Well, they tried to open up the courts, and much like Kansas City, Tara, we shut down the courts. So we put 500 people out in front of Bronx Housing Court, Brooklyn Housing Court, and sort of dared the staff to come in. And the staff, we weren't going to hurt them. We weren't going to harm them. But if you see 500 people with scowls on their face and you were told to come in an office, I think you would think the better of it and turn around and go home. So that basically stalled the process for a while. We're at a point now where we have a right to counsel in this city, guaranteed people to have a lawyer in housing court, but it can't be realized right now because landlords and the courts are trying to catch up on the backload, and they're ramping up the number of evictions that happen. So we're still struggling here in New York, fighting around that issue, and those fights are carried out through two big groups. One, you see Sam wearing a sweatshirt, a hoodie called Housing Justice for All, which is a New York State coalition of tenant organizing groups and housing organizing groups. And then there's the Right to Counsel Coalition, which is basically New York City based, that are organizing themselves and bringing tenants together. Those are groups that I support. And I just want to be clear, I'm sitting in an office of a human rights organization called Partners for Dignity and Rights, formerly called NESRI. I came here as a volunteer in 2009, and I'm still sitting in a chair, unpaid by this organization, because it's where I got my fundamental understanding of human rights between here and the U.S. Human Rights Network. And that work takes me across the globe and into the High Commissioner's office in Geneva, which I got on the horn with this morning around what's going on in South Africa. And that's the power of collaboration and working with movements, right? Because of my work with the UN and UN Special Rapporteurs on Housing, you know, I'm getting them to draft a letter to the High Commissioner's office, and that's going to put some pressure on the South African government. It's not going to stop it. I want to be clear about that. But it will slow things down substantially of what's happening in all the police oppression and some of the tearing down of the shacks and some of these occupations that Zachary mentioned, because now you've turned the camera of the world on Durban, South Africa, and that's mostly where the work I do. There's a little bit of work, Zach, in Cape Town with somebody like Ashraf Qasim. I don't know if you know the name, another family member. These are folks that I've been in the trenches with in Durban and in Cape Town. So there's some serious solidarity going on there. But again, I know I sort of speed dated you around the globe, but I've been blessed as an organizer to work with all of these social movements. Strong work in Hungary around homelessness with a group that formed after a group that I was with here in New York called Picture the Homeless. Avarish Mendenke is one of the strongest social groups now working with homeless populations in Hungary. And Victor Avram knows us and Picture the Homeless well, because the group from the US came here and started all that shit, as he likes to say, right? So I'm happy to wear that label and be one of the people wearing that label here. But I'm also grateful to be on the stage with this group of people. And I just want to thank Sam. Sam is somebody that I've worked with for years in New York. And, we were sort of kibitzing about his PhD. And, I knew Sam prior to going to school in his PhD. And just to see him write that book was special. And, it's not many people can finish a book like that before you finish a PhD. And I'll finally say an activist from the Philippines. I met at an airport about 3 years ago. And the first thing she asked me when I met her at the airport, do you know this book? And it was Capital City, Gentrification in the Real Estate State. I said, not only do I know that book, I'm going to introduce you to the person that wrote that book. And it was one of those moments that I enjoyed doing this work. So thank you. And I look forward to dialogue and questions.
Thanks so much, Rob, both for the kind words and for the global tour of housing struggle. So we have a lot to talk about, but we're going to pass back to our organizer, Phil, to do pitch for Red May and for upcoming events, and then we're going to come back and have a discussion.
I hate to interrupt what will obviously be a robust conversation with something as base as a commercial, but do it we must. First, though, I want to tell you what we're offering and where to find it. Go to www.redmayseattle.org and you will find our schedule. As I said today, at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 Eastern, Days Like This from the old Sherelle song, Mama Said There'll Be Days Like This. Who's Mama? I don't know. Maybe we'll find out in the panel. But we have Jody Deem, Aziz Rana, Colleen Lai, Charles Mudede, and Doug Henwood for that. And tomorrow again, we have one event tomorrow, Marxist Poetics. It is at 11 a.m. Pacific time with David Lau, one of the editors of Lana Turner, a very good poet, Sarah Ehlers, and Aditya Bao. On Tuesday, we continue, for those of you who live in Seattle, with our Miklos Janko. Wait a second, I got to get this Hungarian. Hungarian is very hard to pronounce. So it's Janko, Miklos Janko. Hard to pronounce name, great filmmaker. We're showing The Confrontation from 1968, a year of confrontations around the world. We pick up on Thursday at 11 a.m. With Karl Marx, historian of social times and spaces. George Garcia Quesada has written a wonderful book with that title, which is out from Brill Historical Materialism Press. He's going to talk to Massimiliano Tomba and Cordelia Belton and Edward of the podcast Real Abstractions. If you are interested in value form theory or anything about a critique of political economy from Marx, check out that podcast, Real Abstractions, one of the best there is for that. Anyway, lots of stuff coming up and much more. You can find it on our website. We have to fund this baby, particularly since we've been doing this online for 3 years, third year in a row. It's crazy. But next year, we're going back to our festive in-person Saturnalia, where we fly people like you're hearing in this panel from around the country into Seattle. And of course, we record it as we're doing it, but we have something that only the proximity of minds together talking in movie theaters and coffee shops and so forth can produce. Genuine inspirations to share with you. We have to pay for those airfares, and we depend totally on the kindness of strangers. We do not take any money from any organization. I mean, government organization, not that we have anything against civil servants or the state, or at least in the way that libertarians do. We're happy to salute those people who are at least contributing to something other than their own profit and extracting surplus value. But anyway, here's how you do it. You go on www.redmayseattle.org, and you have two choices. You can give at our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May, or you can become a patron at Patreon, which is also on our website at Donate. So again, www.redmayseattle.org. I return this now to Sam Stein, our guide to this conversation of the city, our red cities of the future.
Thanks, Philip. So everybody, please support Red May, and thanks again to Red May for bringing us all together here. Phil mentioned Charles Mudede there, and since we're theoretically in Seattle now, even though we're actually in various different places, he mentioned him earlier as an upcoming speaker, and I was reminded of something that he wrote a couple years ago. He wrote, "Seattle has a number of contradictions that are sharpening by the day. One is that it offers no public housing, but will not permit slums, meaning it will not provide what the market clearly cannot provide, really affordable housing, but it bans the poor from solving this market flaw on their own." And that seemed like something that resonates in all of the places where each of us is involved in housing struggle. There seems to be a constant process of displacing the crisis, whether that's moving shack dwellers from place to place in South Africa, the recent homeless so-called sweeps that we've seen of people rough sleeping in New York, or the kind of eviction machine that Tara is describing that really has no place for people to go. It just forces them to go someplace else. So I wanted to ask you all to reflect on that and maybe answer a very big question, or begin to answer a very big question, which is, what's the state's strategy here? Is it management of structural poverty? Is it the production of disciplined citizens? Is it securing private profit from land? What is the long game that the state is playing by displacing this crisis over and over and over again in the places that you're working?
Nobody's going to jump in, so I'll. Sam, I think those are three huge questions, right? Or the way you phrase it. If you ask me, I think all three of them feed into what the state is doing right now. They certainly haven't come up with answers, right? And I do believe people directly affected have the solutions, right? And that's, from my perspective, being formerly homeless, I know I'm homeless because I don't have a home, right? So provide a home. I mean, it's as basic as that. But when you have a constitution that's mired in old language that believes in property rights, you're up against structures that are hard to reverse. And I think we have to organize ourselves. And I say globally, which is why I invest globally in the market. The struggle is the same everywhere. There's no doubt, right? It might look a little bit different. We might have a little bit more in the US, but the struggle is the same everywhere. So we have to organize ourselves. And I think we have to write the policy. As you know, we attempted, and you know a lot about this, the legislation that during COVID, we came up with a solution. All right, let's have an eviction moratorium 1 year past the official end of the moratorium, and let's not evict anybody. Those are the real answers. But the money makers and the profiteers, they don't like that, right? They're against that. So I think there is no end game right now. We're going to keep banging our heads against structure, against power, until we change power. And I think we're seeing a shift in New York. As you know, our state assembly and Senate is shifting. Our city council, 29 women, a majority of women, mostly progressive. So things are shifting in New York, right? And I often say the policies that are created in the US are distributed around the world. So, and we can distribute. So when I got that eviction moratorium, I got my hands on that shit March 13th or whatever it was, that Sunday. I distributed that shit all over the place. And Marika, you know, had sent it to me, and I sent it around the world. The first place it dropped was South Africa. Yo, here's what we did in New York. Yo, you'll share the shit. Put pressure on your state court. So I think it's going to have to be a solution. I say all that has to come up from the ground, right? It has to be that we take control. And that might be, dare I say, a revolution, right? We might have to raise hell. We didn't do it during the foreclosure crisis when I thought we should have, when the Obama administration pissed on us and said, you know, the banks before the people. But how much more can we take? Everybody has a fill level. So when are we going to rise up and come into a revolution? So I think the solution, the direct answer to your question, I went a little circuitous route, I realize it, is that the solution is going to have to come from the people. And we're going to have to build political power to go up against the power pro. We're going to have to confront the existing power to make that social change.
I really want a video I want like the screen grab of Robert being like, a revolution. It might be that. But soon we need to stop whispering it and start fucking screaming it. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, Sam, the way that you asked the question, my answer is very similar to Robert's. I think it's like all of the things that you named are part of the state strategy. And most days when I think about the state, like in the way that we interact with the state, they don't have a strategy. Like they're a bunch of dummies who are sitting around maintaining the status quo because it's that status quo that has given them and their friends power, right? So it's actually interesting because I think there's a lot more opportunity. There's a lot more power on the table for the taking by the people. If we stop assuming that the state has some grand strategy, and of course they do, of course, like the whole system is violent, and the people who are in power in that system have a strategy and have a vested stake in maintaining that violent system that exists, that prioritizes profits over people's lives today. And I think to assume that they are sitting around and having conversations like this is actually incorrect, right? I think more than that, they're like, you know, hitting send on their emails, kind of going through the motions, assuming that the system that they have power within is going to exist forever. And I actually think the answer is exactly what Robert said. It lives in our disciplined imagination, directed towards building a different world. And I've seen so many examples of the state being completely caught off guard when people reach their tipping point and demand what they are owed, right? And that question of what we're owed, I actually think is also really important for us to think about. You know, people, when we whisper or scream the word revolution, people will call us radicals. But when we talk about what our people need and want in KC Tenants meetings, right, we ask, what would your life be like if you didn't have to worry about the rent? Fred, who's an elderly Black man who lives in this neighborhood in Midtown Kansas City, says, I would run a bike shop. And Miss Pat says, I would buy new shoes. And Philip says, I would have a place to keep my toothbrush. These aren't radical dreams. These are the things that we are owed, right? So I also think it's like when we consider what we're up against, we shouldn't overestimate the strategy that the state has. We shouldn't underestimate it, and we shouldn't be naive about what we're up against. But we also shouldn't overinflate the radicalism inherent in our own demands. It's actually just not that radical to say everyone deserves a home and a place to keep their toothbrush, Philip. And you are completely right and righteous for bringing that demand to the streets and bringing the crisis of your life to the people who created that crisis until you get that place for your toothbrush.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really, really important point that Tara raises, especially in relation to what Rob was saying about, on the one hand, this kind of revolutionary strategy is necessary. On the other hand, when we think about what's actually playing out here, it's not inherently revolutionary to simply take what you need, if you think about it that way, right? It's a sort of survivalism at best that often often isn't motivated by some sort of deep collective politics, though it may generate those politics, right? But often it's this sort of politics of necessity. I was thinking a lot about the way Sam asked that question and counterposing two things. On the one hand, if the government's not going to adequately provide public housing, but on the other hand, it's going to criminalize self-provision under the guise of squatting or whatever else. What in the world is it thinking? And I think Tara's right that it's not thinking, and that there isn't necessarily a coherent rationale or something like it. But what I will say is that in the case of South Africa, one reason that mass public housing never played out, and the reason they developed this provision of individual homes model was explicitly on the suggestion of various neoliberal think tanks in the late 80s and early 90s. And so the housing white paper out of which this policy comes was essentially ghostwritten by a bunch of neoliberal hacks, to put it bluntly, right? And so instead of any kind of mass provision, which they could certainly afford, they turned to this model of individual sort of standalone home provision, which, you know, it's great insofar as you get a house, everyone's for that. But the scale on which they deliver is so slow that it actually, you know, the housing backlog stays constant, or actually it's increased since the end of apartheid. So clearly it's not working. On the other hand, they have absolutely criminalized land occupation, which is why they're, in cities across the country, they're evicting them. And, you know, if you were to go in and as I tried to, and talk to housing officials, when I first got to Durban in 2011 and started interviewing housing officials asking about evictions, oh, there are no evictions, right? Was told again and again and again. Well, I then witnessed evictions firsthand within a week of being told there were no evictions. But a couple things that the government continues to do. So even, I guess we could call it like the government's COVID opportunism, where in Cape Town, I mean, really in cities across the country, they've continued to evict both renters and occupiers during the pandemic, and actually at an increased rate. But when we look at Cape Town, something curious happened at the end of last year, where the city government passed two what they call bylaws. So these two local level, essentially ordinances in a US context. One was like what goes by the name of a sit-lie ordinance in a US context. They called it, had a long name, but essentially a nuisance ordinance that gives them the ability to not just remove, but actually arrest individuals who are doing anything defined as squatting on public land, including begging, right? Second, they passed this unlawful occupation bylaw, which essentially emphasizes what's already the law. I mean, it's already tough to secure land if you're going to occupy the thing, but there's this kind of disdain for these constitutional rights that when I would interview housing officials again and again, would hear like, oh, our lenient constitution, it's so hard to govern and blah, blah, blah. So I actually think it's less about a coherent rationale and more about, at least in the case of South Africa, government officials upset that they can't sort of solve the housing crisis in one fell swoop. They don't have a good solution. And so they stigmatize occupiers as a cause as opposed to a consequence of the entire thing.
Yeah, I think that's pretty profound and really troubling also. That, first of all, that there is no they necessarily, next that they don't have a solution, and then third that they, you know, basically formulate the problem as, you know, the outcome of that lack of solution as the problem. I'm interested in the way that Tara framed this as what do they owe us? And of course it brought me to that Crass song. Do they owe us a living? And the answer is, of course they fucking do. And it's a great song, but like, what's so great about it is who is they, who is us, what is a living, and how do we know that the answer is of course they fucking do. And I think that like there's a common sense to that, but there's something kind of deep there too, and probably also something that we might all answer somewhat differently. And it gets into this question of like, is this all that radical for us to get the living that we're owed? And I think people's first response was no, it's actually not that radical for a person to have a place to put their toothbrush. And I totally agree. But then when you try to operationalize it, and I think that that's some of what we're seeing in the South African case, it gets radical fast. And that's also what we've seen in New York and Kansas City when we get in place an eviction moratorium and the state freaks out and the landlords freak out. And as a person who's trained in geography, I tend to ask the question where and when. And so, you know, if we have a right to housing, if we're owed housing, okay, where? In whose neighborhood? In what kind of a building? Who lives there now? Do they still live there after those who are denied homes live there? Are we going to knock down existing homes and build new ones? Once you get to where, it gets very radical very quickly. And then the when side of it, because there is no where without a when, is for how long. So, you know, we all mobilized around eviction blockades, and we succeeded in that for a time. We could close down the eviction system legally for a while, and then we could close it down extra legally for a while. But it's very hard to maintain that without a solution to where do people go, or either how do they pay the rent, or how is rent no longer a thing. So we run up against a time scale question too, and I think it comes up in Zach's case study, where we have a right to housing in South Africa with a 60-year waiting list in a country where people have a 64-year life expectancy. So, you know, sure, you can get your right to housing, you just have to wait 60 years. That's not much of an adequate right. So if we bring the time scale of when down to right now, and if we bring the geographic location of where to wherever the hell we want, that is an extremely radical program for something that should be, you know, quite basic. So I don't know how to turn that into a question, but I wonder if you all agree with that premise or have anything to say in response.
You don't know how to turn it into a question, but you know how to poke us. You really know how to poke us to think, man. This is why I always appreciated you, brother. So it is, for me, listen, I like to claim vacant space, right? Take Back the Land's premise was put homeless people in people's homes. You solve the problem, right? I think there's a lot of vacant space here. I like radical approaches. I like putting action to practice. I like taking over buildings. I was always upset personally because we never had a Take Back the Land local action group in New York City, right? Multi-story buildings. Let's take one of these suckers, man. I watched the European Squatters Collective build these types that put 500 families in a single building, right? And start to work as a collective, and it becomes a commune. So, Sam, in the city that we live in, I think wealth and poverty exist side by side. So to me, I think there is a way that you can do it now. You may not like it, Mr. Wealthy person. You bitch when the person sat at the bus stop, but now they're not at the bus stop. They're in that building that used to be a hotel over there. Deal with it, right? Tough. I know it's not that easy, but I think that's what we have to start thinking. We have to think outside of the box. I think there's vacant space here where we can house people. The other thread that comes through this to me is universal basic income, right? If you say the poverty line is this, Mr. Power, government, or whoever you are, you say the minimum basic income is $20,000, but family X is only bringing in 16, well, then you need to give them 4. I think it can be done. We all got stimulus checks. Listen, I like money. I don't know if I necessarily needed it. There's probably somebody that was more needy than me. So we have the means to do it. When we want to stimulate the economy, we do it. When we want to make the 1% wealthy, we found a way to do it. But then now the responsibility is to stimulate the poor. Oh, you don't want to do that, right? So, I don't know the answer. I do think, though, that we can, Sam, provide the resources to do it. You know, there was this huge infrastructure bill. I kept hearing about it at big debates. I never heard the word fucking housing in it any time. Housing is infrastructure. So we got to change the way people think too, right? Like, you know, it's complicated. It is not easy. And I understand you couldn't put it in a question because this shit is so deep rooted. And for me, it sort of weaves through the whole reparations struggle, right? Like when I get into this human rights stuff and I get in spaces, people are asking for reparations. What is it? We got to define it. You can keep getting in these spaces and yelling at it and calling out the word, but we need to clearly define it. We're going to have to come up with that solution, right? So for me, maybe reparations is housing the poor, right? We have to just, I think, again, going back to the last question, solutions got to come from the people directly affected. And it's no easy answer, right? In this society, but we see it playing out in other countries. You go to the Nordic countries, that universal basic income exists in a couple of those countries, right? You're below the poverty line, here's your $5,000 check, family A. Okay, you're good, right? Not everybody has to have the same level of living, right? Yeah, we have the choice here. If you're not dependent on the government, go do your own thing. But there are some people that need a leg up, and those same people that need a leg up are probably the people that had obstacles put in front of them ever since this country was created. So I'll stop there because I could go on about this stuff.
Yeah, I'm not, I mean, Sam, you didn't really pose a question, so I'll just talk based on where I moved to talk at this point. But so I think you're right. Like as much as it feels compelling and true to say that it's not that radical what we're demanding. Of course, the reality of today is such that it sounds radical. It is radical. We're up against a lot. So at KC Tenants, we have a campaign called our North Star campaign, where we're organizing to try to win municipal social housing here. And actually, when we break down that as a theoretical concept into an actual thing that we're trying to win here, is at once where it gets easier and more difficult. The easier thing is we actually aren't like New York City. We're not like San Francisco. There is a lot of space and place to do social housing in Kansas City. And anyone who tells you that is not true is just lying, right? And then the difficulty is even more pronounced because of the lacking political will and imagination to actually do this, right? The only thing local officials can conceptualize, if anything at all, is a one-off cooperative or land trust or something like that. What we're talking about is municipal social housing at a degree of scale that would actually intervene in the market. And the way that we want to win that is through, for example, our school districts, unfortunately, because of years and years of disinvestment now have more properties that are empty and are not functioning school buildings than they have properties that are school buildings, right? Instead of allowing those properties to be lost forever to speculators who are going to build market rate apartments in those old school buildings, or instead of them being purchased up by charter schools and having our education system even more privatized within those buildings, we want to try to force some kind of sale or handoff of that land and property from the school districts to the city. And that's in everyone's interest. It keeps students in the city, in the district, and it keeps and it gives the city an option to actually at scale intervene in this market that's run away from us, right? That is completely out of sync with what Kansas City is. This is Kansas City. There's nothing in this city that's worth paying $2,500 for a freaking apartment. Trust me, if there was a good place to dance, maybe, but there ain't that. There's not a place where you can get dinner after 8 p.m. Everyone knows that rents are out of control, right? And there has to be some kind of real strategy to intervene. So I think it's at once harder and easier when we actually think concretely about how do we make this shit happen here. I had another thing I was going to say, but now I lost it. So I'll stop there.
And I wanted to kind of continue that thread and bring it back to something that Sam raised that I thought was a really interesting way of thinking about this, about what the state can do in terms of space and time, or we might say location and time or something like this. And I think on the one hand, it sounds fantastic if I were to think about the government distributing free homes to people. But on the other hand, when you think about where those homes tend to be located, in the South African case, you wind up essentially rendering the geography of apartheid permanent. So, just to really briefly characterize it, if we were to take a city like Cape Town, you have a belt of largely Xhosa-speaking Black Africans going just east of the city, but far from the city center. Majority white population proximal to the city center, suburbs that are majority white south of the city center. And then on either side of that black belt, you have a so-called colored belt. So another ethno-racial population under apartheid on both sides. And so it's quite engineered. Or if you were to look at, say, Johannesburg, just south of the city, you have massive Black African townships, most famously Soweto. And then between this kind of buffer, we have Indian and so-called colored townships between the city center and those townships. And so to simply deliver formal housing winds up formalizing the racist geography of apartheid, which isn't to say that people don't want homes. And, it raises a really complicated set of problems because people have built communities there, but at the same time, no one wants to be on this peripherally located land, nowhere close to employment opportunities or anything like it. And then when it comes to time, the one thing I'll say is that the Constitution does guarantee the right to housing, but there's this provision built into the Bill of Rights that says that the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve progressive realization of this right. So in other words, a massive caveat that they have to try, basically. Now, the last thing I'll say on this is that when you think, and tying these together, when you talk about the state delivering housing and delivering it now, and having that be on well-located land, again and again, I would run into the same justification as to why housing is not provided on better located land, which is that the government buys up a bunch of land on which to distribute this housing. They call it land banking. And to get a sufficient amount of land, they buy cheap land. Well, where is that land located? So short of expropriating without compensation land proximal to the city center, they're never going to get this land. And if they are to be pushed to do that, and I do think, and this is where I would return to Tara's point, and even what Rob was saying earlier, right? That in order to do that, they need to be pushed to do that. And this is why I see land occupations as so central to achieving any of this. That unless people actually take that land themselves, and certainly they are going to face repression, and it's going to be violent, unfortunately, but that if people don't expropriate that land, the government's not going to even think about expropriating that land. And so this is where I think mass action plays a huge role, even in setting something as seemingly distant as government policy.
So if I could just jump in and just parallel to that, Zach, the MST in Brazil, that's how that movement built itself, right? On that level of thinking. We have to confront the government, right? And you can't just give this land in the Amazon to these wealthy landowners. No, we're going to take it. And then they built themselves into the largest social movement in the world, 2 million strong, and now are building a political party in Brazil, right? So, they built themselves some power, and it's that constant confrontation because, as you say, the government was trying to take a hold of it. And if they give you land, they give it on the periphery, and they're starting to push you further and further out, right? And, a couple of the professors that Sam and I have always worked with, and I thought about Peter Marcuse as Sam asked this question. Peter was always the one at Left Forum or some of the spaces I'm in to sort of poke the way Sam did to get people to respond in certain ways. So Sam, I just appreciate that quality. It made me think a little bit about Peter, and we were having some discussions a couple of weeks ago about Peter. Peter's been a huge influence on me and my work, and I thought about Sam picking up that little that way that Peter had of inducing a conversation and making it rich. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, we lost Peter Marcuse about a month ago after a very long and rich life. And if you're not familiar with Peter's work, definitely encourage folks to check it out. A lot of it is publicly available. I mean, I think we're kind of getting to a question of force and the state. Zach, you're basically describing a situation where the state will not force private property owners to socialize their land, but they will force shack dwellers to get off of land that they don't have legal title to. So, you know, the state is willing to use force to clear land. It's just, you know, what are going to be the consequences of that? And I was thinking about that earlier in your talk also, when you were saying that, you know, how the movements become statified or are brought into the state. And you said that, you know, it's about language, that the language that gets used becomes a language of rights, and that immediately brings you into this question of interaction with the state and playing on their terrain. But it's very much from what you describe also a question of force. Who has the means to resist? And right now the wealthy landowners who own the central property have the means to resist a campaign to expropriate. Like in Berlin, there was a popular initiative that land is going to be expropriated from the largest landholder who got it from the state earlier on, but the state is not yet willing to actually do that. So we get to this question of force and power, wherein we have the moral right to a lot of things that we don't yet have the right to force the state to do. I think we've talked a lot already about things we want the state to do, and I've talked a lot about things I want the state to do, and then I'm like confronted immediately with the question, this state? You want this state to do that? Why would this state do that? This is not what this state does. And then we're back in the question of force and how do we get another state? So I wonder if you're also running into that contradiction between what the state can do and what this state does, and how you see the movements responding to that. And before I throw it to the panel, I'll just say quickly, we are starting to get some questions. If anybody wants to put questions in the comments, we're seeing them, and that's where I'm going to turn to next.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that that's a great question, and that the idea of this state, right, the state that we actually have, unfortunately, is what we have to deal with. And when I think about, on the one hand, obsessing over the letter of the law, but then on the other hand, seeing how the state actually enforces evictions. So for example, in Cape Town, technically, this anti-land invasion unit that I mentioned, it's not allowed to remove homes. That's why they work with the police. The police are sanctioned to remove homes. In practice, I saw them do it regularly, and they would return daily. They would define a structure and then remove whatever constitutes the structure. And then once occupiers have their building materials taken, they were living under overturned shopping carts with tarps, and then those were repossessed. Eventually, they dug burrows into the ground and were living there. And then those were filled with sand. And so it's, yeah, when we think about the level of force, that's often illegally deployed force. And so this kind of obsession over the language of rights, I think, on the one hand, you know, makes it easier to defend any housing gains. But on the other hand, when government officials and cops don't follow the actually existing law, it's pretty hard to enter into any relationship of trust, and actually probably strategically stupid to do so. And the final thing I'll say is that in most cases where I did see victories, and by victories, you know, it's sort of a bittersweet victory, because I'm talking about a land occupation that doesn't get evicted, but thousands of people stuck living in a shack, often without access to electricity or toilets, or, you know, so it's a provisional victory, but it's not a kind of ultimate victory. And even here, short of forcibly taking land and defending it, and returning day after day after day, and essentially proving a thorn in the state's side, to put it that way, people aren't winning. I mean, in a certain sense, the government tries to in that context, draw it out and hope people leave. And often they do, because these court cases often last for years. And you can imagine if cops are showing up An anti-land invasion unit is illegally repossessing people's building materials daily. At a certain point, they give up and go elsewhere. And so I really do think that popular force is the most viable solution here.
Rob or Tara, any thoughts before we move on to the next question?
I'll just say quickly, I think here in the context of New York and the United States, we don't readily embrace the language of human rights, especially our government. So it's been effective in certain ways, right? The relationship we've built with UN Special Rapporteurs on housing and then going to Geneva for reviews of the US has caused the US to send a posse behind us. What are they going to say now? What are they telling the rest of the world? And it gets reaction. So I was involved in a piece of case law, Martin versus Boise, the criminalization of the homeless. And we took that to Geneva. And that's how we got the United States to say criminalizing homelessness, if you have no alternative, is real, right? And you got to stop. So we've been able to effectively use that. And I think Maryland Legal Services is using the human rights frame in housing court and being effective. What we have to get over is the fear, as I like to say when I talk to legal services and lawyers, of the black robes and those fucking scales that sit in there that says everything is even. Because in the human rights world, the right of a person to live in a home versus the right of a landlord or speculator to own a home or sell it, the right to live in there outweighs that. And we have to start thinking in that term. So we need legal people to go into courts and sort of challenge that prevailing narrative of our civil constitution, because the right to live in a home versus the right to profit of a home, it just outweighs it to me. And I think the more that we can incorporate that in our everyday language and get people to understand that, things will change. Quickly, I'll say, we had the UN high-level meetings last week in New York before I went down to Georgia to visit family. And I was sitting with mayors from all over the world. And I took my 12 minutes, instead of going on pause with the global platform on the right to the city, I called out New York City, because there was nobody from New York City in that fucking room, because they don't believe about human rights. So you throw them under the fucking bus and you back it up and you run over them again, right? You know what happened the next day? City Hall is reaching out to me by email and by telephone. Oh, no, I'm not coming to City Hall. You want to come talk to me about it? You come to the Nesri office. I'm at 90 John Street. So I think the more, it's a little different than the South African context. I get it, because I'm embedded there and understand exactly the way Zach is doing it. But I think what we have to learn is to take the tools that we have and use them effectively. Because with respect to human rights, our government shows exceptionalism. And unfortunately, some of our people directly affected have an exceptionalist attitude when it comes to human rights. So, I don't want to preach, so I'll stop right there.
Thanks, Rob. Tara, do you want to share a final thought? I know you got to go in a minute.
Sure. Just some appreciation, Sam. I think this question is really important and one that we struggle with, and I'd be lying if I said I had an answer to. I think during COVID in particular, we encountered real struggle with our relationship to this state. And, we started a mutual aid fund and a hotline to take care of our people because they needed fucking help. And we needed to show up for the people in a way that this state was not showing up for them. And we've experienced the ways that this state then questions and problematizes their own role because they see the people taking care of themselves. So I think it's just this really difficult thing where we're making demands of the state and we're living in a world, operated by this state, and the world of today creates such crisis for our people that we have to take matters into our own hands, but that lets the state off the hook a little bit. So I think we just live in that contradiction a little bit. So I have to run because we have this big launch event tomorrow and I have to prep with some of our organizers, but it's been such an honor and so much fun to be in conversation with you all. I wanted to share just a final thought. Here's a quote. "Housing shortage is no accident. It's a necessary part of the social order where private splendor and public squalor is the order of the day. Only forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions will enable us to solve this problem." These are words that were delivered in a speech by my grandfather in Mysore, India in the year 1977. Obviously, he was a commie. He was organizing with his people back then. But I found these words just a couple of years ago, and I was like, holy shit. Like literally his diagnosis of the problem is my diagnosis of the problem halfway across the world years and years ago. That doesn't give me a lot of hope, honestly, because I'm like, damn, he was dealing with the same shit back then. On the other hand, I think it's very fitting with the theme here. And it leads to my kind of concluding thought, which is that I think there's something, there's a couple things that have been really compelling me recently. One is this idea that we have a responsibility to kind of innovate a new praxis in the tenant movement. If we're all honest with ourselves, the tenant movement is sort of a farce, right? And we actually have to build a movement of tenants and innovate a new praxis around tenant organizing to build the kind of power that will be necessary in order to win the things that we've been talking about on this call. So some of it is like brand spanking new, and we just have to realize that we are going to be the inventors of an art and science of tenant organizing that hasn't existed before. And there is so much to learn from global struggle and historical struggle that can help us ground that new innovation and praxis that we need to pursue. We can learn from, of course, South Africa, as we've talked about on this call. We can learn from my grandfather's struggle in, post-independence India in the 70s. We can learn from the sharecroppers in Missouri. We've been studying a lot the sharecropper movement in Missouri as we think about rural organizing in our state. Sharecroppers, Black and brown, who took the possessions out of their house, put them on the side of the road, and won some of the first public housing in this country in, basically the rural South. So I think there's I'm very inspired and excited and challenged by needing to, the knowledge of needing to build new shit and push the boundaries of what has been done before, and at once really study the global and historical struggle that has come before us and is around us today. So with that, I'll leave you all. Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure, and I can't wait to connect with all of you soon. Wish us luck tomorrow, by the way. 10,000 tenants strong. Let's do this.
Amazing.
All the best, Tara.
Thank you.
Zach, Rob, we're coming up on time, so I just want to give you both the chance to have any closing remarks, plug any upcoming events or publications that you've got, and close us out.
I'd like to make an unusual way to close this out. So one of the spaces, Sam, and you know this well, that I appreciate being in as an organizer is the academic space. I think you have to mix practice with theory. And when I came into this organizing work, I was told you can't do that, right? You have to draw a line between your organizing and academia. Sam knows the story that Neil Smith, the great geographer and anthropologist, brought me into academia. And, then I met people like Peter Marcuse, and I met, David Harvey, but then I met students like Sam and some of these incredible thinkers. And I'm appreciative of these spaces that are mixed. Me and Tara, who are doing the work on the ground, Zach and Sam, who have the academic minds. And I do think that there is a such thing as activist academia, right? Sujatha Fernandez, Sam, used to always challenge that idea. And I always had to encourage her, no, there is a such thing. So I'm just appreciative of being in the space and the way that this came together. I think we have to collaborate to make the social change or create another world, as Tara mentioned. And it takes a collaboration. It takes a collaboration with the legal community. Those are the policy people, right? They understand the language. We talked about language in this, and I don't understand all of that language, but I know who I need to go get to take my words and put it in a language that's going to challenge power, right? So I'm just appreciative of spaces like this. And Zach, I will reach out to you individually because I want to know more, since you're embedded in, my distant family spaces. So I just appreciate what you brought to this conversation, and, adding to the relationship that I have already over there. It's just going to, give me a deeper foundation and deeper roots. And then Sam, just thank you for the moderation. I'll always appreciate you, bro.
Yeah, and I want to sort of flip it and say the inverse, that I think without activists, this kind of academic work is meaningless here. You know, and I really do try to think about my academic work in relation to questions of strategy. And without movements on the ground, none of that matters. And so I'll say that, you know, as much as I can do my policy analyst dance and that sort of thing, I really do think that the most central part of this, at least for me, in terms of getting knowledge of these struggles, has been being a part of these struggles and working with struggles on the ground, whether it's land occupiers, whether it's, I know Rob mentioned Abahlali Basimjindolo in Durban. In Cape Town, when I started this, I started working with a group called the Housing Assembly that did something kind of comparable, but beyond just this category of shack dweller, tried to build this alliance across various housing types. So renters facing eviction, those who received shoddy government homes that are falling apart, land occupiers, people living in backyards, trying to unite them into some sort of mass movement and a citywide movement. And I think without that kind of mass pressure, and we've already talked about this a little, but that policy is only going to get us so far, which isn't to say we shouldn't be conscious of it and follow it quite closely and engage in legal strategy where we can. But again and again, I've seen that, at least in the South African context, the way to get the goods involves occupying land en masse and holding it. And it's not pretty, it's not easy, and it's not a picnic, right? Like taking land is a violent experience, as the cops come in daily, as you often face jail time, you're left to defend yourself in the elements, as your building materials themselves are reappropriated and so forth. But I do see these sorts of mass movements and above all land occupations as a central way to even push policy, if we want to put it that way. Sometimes directly engaging policy is unfortunately a way to be absorbed by that policy. So, and you know, not in every single context, and we can talk about each individual context, but I do often think that to make these gains, direct confrontation and well-organized direct confrontation. So I'm not talking about individuals here, right? But collective, well-articulated and organized mass pressure is what gets the goods. So I just wanted to thank, yeah, Rob, I'm definitely going to reach out just because I want to talk about all this stuff. Sam, great moderation, and Philip, thanks as always for fantastic.
Yeah, I thank you, everybody. You've left us enough threads to start 5 other conversations that deserve to be pursued. I was thinking as we're going, I mean, Sam, your notion of the questions when and where as a geographer are very interesting points to begin with. For example, in Seattle, the whole center of the city has been filled with dreck. The city was built around the notion of serving cruise ships and convention centers and so forth. And suddenly neither of those are operative at the moment and may never be operative in the same way. And they've got a downtown where at the center of the equivalent of 50th and 5th Avenue, there were 10 people there at noon. The other day when I was down there, it was literally amazing. 15 years, 20 years ago, you would have like 200-300 people at lunch, but nothing. The other is when you throw around phrases like state, the state, and so forth, it makes me sad that we never do the panel on the theory of the state that I keep wanting to do, especially as we have a sociologist here and can go over it. But we're talking about the state, government, administration, constitution, nation, all of these separate things, and city public servants of the planners that are part of Sam's group that are clearly part of the outside of this housing problem, trying to get into whatever it is that is blocking it. So we have to decompose the state down into areas which are, potentially collaborating with us, and those that are opposing, and figure out what they are. Are they just the electeds for a particular period that are the obstacles, along with, certain other groups? Or are there people within the states who are agents who can blow it up? How can we use it along the way as we move towards the withering away or something like that, whatever that means? And the last thing is, the question that people kept talking about rights and constitution. And all I can think, well, the Constitution is, of course, part of the state. And it is, in fact, a part of the state that, as we have seen for the last 150 years, is capable of being twisted to mean anything the people in the state want it to mean. The 14th Amendment can mean corporate personhood. I mean, insane when you look at it. But since you literally construe anything out of anything, the notion of putting your chips on a constitution or talking about the Constitution as if it's not part of the state, or as if the idea of a constitution can be left untouched, rather than something that is attacked head on, by the masses, as opposed to invoked, we're fulfilling the true Constitution as the other people are not, are questions that are questions that might sound of abstract theory, but have a lot to do with how the left is oriented. Constitutions judicialize politics. What we're trying to do is to restore a broader notion of mass politics that are essentially liberalism constraints down to almost no politics at all, or our representatives handle stuff. Good stuff to talk about in terms of city planning in the future, but hopefully the next time we can do it on the ground in Seattle and continue this discussion, walking around and, marking the buildings that have to go with X's or red X's, just as an art event to do it for a week. So
let me know when, Phil. That's my specialty, going out, right? And pointing out the buildings. That's the one we're going to take.
Yeah. And Sam and Zach, it's great to see you guys again.
Yeah, you too. And I was going to say, wild if you I assume you haven't read my book since it just came out, but that's literally the argument of the book, complete with the word judicialize. So
okay, great. I want to, I think I have a PDF of it. I should go out and buy it. Is it at academic prices now, or is it? I'll
send you the discount.
Huh? Oh,
I got like
okay. I'll do that. I do want to read it for sure. And Rob, great to meet you. What team have you got your hat on there? Is that a
New York Yankees? I only wear Sam can attest that you'll often see me in a Yankee hat. If I ever change, it's LA Dodgers. It's not so much the love of the team, it's just the color.
Well, and thank you. I want to, so people who are watching, go out, have a drink, eat lunch, or actually, if you're on the East Coast, have your happy hour, and then come back and see Jody Dean, Doug Henwood, Aziz Rana, Colleen Lai, and Charles Mudede in Days Like Us. That's at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. Thanks very much.
Phil, thank you. Thanks for having us. And Sam, thank you. I'll be in touch with you guys.
Yeah, you too. You too.
Nice to meet you, Zach.
Are we all